A famous Terminator once said, Judgment Day is inevitable. What about Florida State's future in the ACC? That's what we're talking about today on Warchant TV. I am joined by Ira Schoffel, the managing editor of Warchant.com, and Gene Williams, the founder and administrator of Warchant.com. Not a fan of the ACC, is Gene Williams. So we'll get right to the topics here in
Hey,
part.
you are?
Oh, no. Oh, come on.
Come on.
You and I both know we've been in the same camp for a long time here, but I'm just going to pass the ball around because this is the roundtable. There's a full feature on warchant.com where you can see our staff's insights and their thoughts on FSU's future in the ACC. Do us a favor, like this video as you're watching this content. But we will start with the timeline. How soon can Florida State realistically be out of the ACC and in a new conference? I will toss it to the man who is in Amelia Island for us at Warchant. Ira, your thoughts on the timeline of when this relationship, when this marriage will end in divorce?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to pick, I'd say sooner than later. Again, the contract, the grant of rights, and the contract with the ACC and ESPN goes out till 2036. And I think, in months past, we've thought, well, maybe as it gets closer to 2030 or closer to 2032, that's when, you'd see movement. But now I think it's going to be much sooner than that. And I think it's for two reasons. One, it's not sustainable. The ACC's leadership or Florida State's leadership realizes there's no way they can just keep going the way things have been going and losing $30 to $40 million a year compared to schools in the SEC and the Big Ten. So that's one reason they don't want it to go much further. And the other thing is, I think if you look at the moves we've seen from the Big Ten and the SEC, the Big Ten going out and getting USC and UCLA being very aggressive, going and getting a couple of West Coast schools. And then you look at what the SEC did, getting Texas and Oklahoma. And I think there's kind of a lot of people wonder whether or not either of those conferences is still in expansion mode. But I think both of them are battling to see who can be the best conference, the biggest conference, the strongest, most profitable conference. And I think that's what gives Florida State, Clemson, and a couple other schools some leverage right now. And I think Florida State's pushing the initiative. So I think it's going to be sooner. As far as an exact time frame, it's hard to say. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if this is all kind of done in the next 2 or 3 years.
Gene Williams, the back channels and a lot of contacts at Florida State upper level administration over the years, and you've made no bones about your opinion, as I said in the beginning, about Florida State's current conference. What do you think, and what are some of the things that maybe you've heard in the last few weeks about FSU's future in the ACC, and what do you think the timeline might be?
Well, I think Ira's definitely on it. It's sooner rather than later. I think, honestly, a while ago, we were all saying, you know what, let this thing play out a little bit. Let that price tag drop a little bit on that grant of rights. Maybe 5, 7, 8 years down the road, it becomes manageable. But I think that's no longer the case. I think because of that, and Michael Alford mentioned it when he talked about that huge revenue disparity, that 30 to 40 million between the teams you're competing against, what you're having to face. That just keeps building and building. I don't think you can wait 4, 5, 6 years for this thing. You're going to be in such a hole that I don't know if you can ever climb out at that point. And that 30 to 40 million, once Texas, Oklahoma, USC, those teams start going to those conferences, I've seen some projections, that gap's going to get even wider in a few years. So FSU can't afford to do that. I honestly think what I'm hearing, they're really going to press this issue. I think in the next 2 to 4 years, there will be a fundamental change. Now, I think the fundamental change could happen really soon, but I mean, when FSU's actually, when they move on to some different entity that they're involved with, I think that's going to be in the next 2 to 4 years. They will no longer be in the ACC. They can't be in the ACC if they wish to continue to be a top tier program.
Guys, is the logic that, and Gene, I'll circle back, we'll go to the reverse order, but is the thinking that you're going to be spending the money one way or the other? Like if worst case, if Florida State had to go litigate, you'd be losing the money anyway, and the gap if you stayed with the status quo. Does that enter like the common sense reason as to why, if they would press the issue if they didn't have the formal 8 or 10 teams to just say, we're going to dissolve this thing?
It would still be tough because, I mean, there is that grant of rights out there. If you don't have enough of a push to somehow break that up, and again, there's a lot of minutia in how that could theoretically happen. But if, let's say you have 8 teams, I think you can start making some fundamental changes, whether that's breaking the conference up or changing or getting rid of that grant of rights somehow. Then it's workable. Then there's just the exit fee to get out of the conference, which I think is somewhat manageable. So I think that's got to happen. I don't think you can just sit there and wait or try to go right now, let's go litigate and get out of the conference and just hope things work out. That's really rolling the dice unless you've got some master plan to take care of that grant of rights. And I think Peter Collins said, we've got a handle on the grant of rights, so let's hope Florida State does.
Ira, your thoughts there? I mean, again, if Florida State stood pat, there would be a $30 to $40 million gap. We get that. That was, spoken loud and clear at the Board of Trustees meeting. The risk of litigation, if they can't get the teams necessary to all be aligned and say we're riding at the same time, one way or the other, you're going to pay if that's the worst case, but at least you would land in a different conference. Do you think that that's part of the math?
Yeah, 100%. And, I wrote the other day, I think, people look at it as there's risk if you try to get out of the contract. Yes. If Florida State were to go it alone or only go with a couple of schools, they'd have to pay that exit fee and then also make sure the grant of rights is not a concern. And the exit fees, you're looking at $120 million. I mean, that's not something Florida State or Clemson or anybody wants to do, but I think they'd be willing to do it if that's their only option. What the dream scenario, as Gene mentioned, is, dissolve the conference. And whether that's, getting these 7 or 8 teams that are discussing it right now and getting them all on board. And then there's some options after that. Is it finding homes for them in the SEC and the Big 10 and Big 12, or is it maybe starting another conference, joining with a few other schools and starting their own conference? I think the point is the only thing that's not on the table is Florida State just sitting and stewing for 13 more years in a conference where they make $30 to $40 million less than their biggest rival every single year. And, as Michael Alford said in the interview we had with him about a week or two ago, the Big 12 is going to renegotiate. So you'd have UCF, a school with no national championships, a school with no college football playoff appearances, and very little history other than 1 or 2 seasons, where they'd be making more money than a school like Florida State. So it's just the only thing that I think that's off the table is just sitting and riding it out here. I think there are some options, and we'll see how those play out.
So this is what's interesting to me, guys. If Florida State gets out of this entire deal, you pay the $120 million or you dissolve the conference, whatever it is. Let's just say the matter is settled with the grant of rights as well. If that's extra money, if it's, you have enough teams, whichever scenario. At that point, Florida State is not tied to ESPN any longer. And so it affords Florida State the opportunity, in theory, to be a free agent to either of the Power 2 conferences. There's obvious reasons that they would tie into both. For the Big 10, it would be a new part of the footprint. They've already gone to the West, but they could expand to the Southeast. For the SEC, it's as natural as it gets. I think for the city of Tallahassee, they're rooting for the SEC pretty hard because you'd have a lot of fan bases get in their cars and come down to Tallahassee for weekends of not just football, but all sports. But what do you think about the viability of both of the options? Of course, the SEC seems more natural, but Ira, back to you. I mean, would it be at that point a real bidding war for Florida State, or do you think they would lean heavily towards the SEC because of the regionality?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people that follow Florida State, most Florida State fans, would want to be in the SEC if possible. There are some people who see the merits of going to the Big Ten, and they like the idea of some of the reasons. There are some reasons that the Big Ten would be attractive, but I think most people would like to see Florida State in the SEC. It makes fit culturally. It makes fit in terms of rivalries, location, all of those reasons. And there might also be another factor that we don't know, because one of the challenges in reporting on this story for the last several years is none of us can see the TV contract. We've requested it, Gene. We put in paperwork in the past to request copies of the TV contract. You can't get it. That's why all these lawyers have been going to North Carolina, is because they won't release it to the schools, because then it becomes public record. So these attorneys are going there to look at that and look at the grant of rights. So we don't know exactly what the tie-in there is. There's one school of thought that as long as Florida State were to stay with an ESPN-affiliated conference, such as the SEC, maybe that's one of those things that kind of takes care of some of the issues with the grant of rights, because that's who the deal is with. Again, it's hard to say with a 100% certainty of how it works out, but that would be one reason. But the other thing is, and I think a lot of people have made the point through the last couple of years, is if ESPN's already paying FSU $36 million a year, it is right now. Maybe it gets to $40 million a year in the ACC. Why would they want to pay them more to come over to the SEC? Well, that's where the Big Ten becomes a factor. And if the Big Ten and Fox, they want to make a big splash, they wanted to get at the state of Florida, they want to get on the Eastern Seaboard. Now you have a reason, some incentive for ESPN to make that move. So, I think it's from a Florida State's perspective, I think most people would like to be in the SEC, but you got to dance with the Big Ten, because they may be the reason you have a calling card with the SEC, or you may have to just make that jump to the Big Ten.
Is it just me, or does it seem like in Greensboro, in order to view the contract, the TV contract, you have to have two people with a key that count down 3, 2, 1 at the same time in order to open a vault? That's what it feels like to me, at least. But Gene, your thoughts on the viability of the Big Ten, legitimate or not? And then, of course, the SEC being a natural fit. What do you think?
I was thinking of that what you were talking about there, Tom, too. Like, I guess they put their cell phones in a box, or because you could take a picture of the contract. I mean,
from what I understand,
they're
from what I
probably in a
understand,
Faraday cage where nothing can get out. I mean, I'd love to be in that room. That's funny.
Literally,
I'm told they can take notes. I'm told they can take notes, but they can't take pictures.
That's awesome. No, I mean, Ira's right. Geographically, if we're in a vacuum, it's SEC all the way. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, you have all these teams in a geographic area. The FSU fans could drive to Mississippi, Georgia, all these places that are nearby. Same thing. Obviously, those fans could come in. Doak Campbell would be a completely different Doak Campbell on most Saturdays instead of sleepy old Wake Forest rolling in. I mean, think about, whatever. Think about Auburn rolling in, and what's that going to be like? It's a totally different animal. So it'd be great from that perspective. I do think the Big Ten is very viable, though, and I think what Ira touched on, I think because they are looking to become, and I've talked to some people up high in it, they are very excited about the potential of being the national conference, because by adding USC, and we're hearing about Washington and Oregon and those kind of schools potentially also being there, they really also covet North Carolina. You think of a North Carolina, Florida State, Clemson, maybe even a Miami on there. They can sell this product nationally now, where the SEC is stuck in a geographic region. I mean, for those purposes, it's going to open up a lot of doors for the Big Ten. And I think they might be willing to. Here's the end of the day. Everybody has their price. I think the Big Ten, if FSU is able to get out of that grant of rights and is not, tied into ESPN in any way, shape, or form, I think the Big Ten, a.k.a. Fox, might be able to pay a little bit more money to help Florida State mitigate those damages of paying that exit fee or whatever other fines they might have to pay, be able to do that, and also at the same point to stick it to ESPN and stick it to the SEC. So I think the Big Ten is a little bit more viable than most people believe. But again, I think from a fan perspective, media perspective, the SEC would much clearly be a better fit.
It also one other, and sorry to interrupt you, Tom, one other aspect to it, and I know the answer with the SEC. I'm not as sure the answer with the Big Ten. One of the problems with the ACC is their fans don't travel. For 80% of those schools, they're not bringing, they may bring 300 people, 200 people. So now you've got to sell every ticket through your own fan base. If it's the SEC, and it doesn't matter if you're playing Mississippi State or Arkansas or any of those schools are going to fill up their 10,000 seats at Doak. Do we think the Big Ten schools would do that? I guess that's obviously Michigan would. There's probably a few schools.
Ohio State.
But how do we feel about that? Do we feel like that would be as strong?
I brought that up in the roundtable, which you can read on warchant.com, and I call it the flotsam. The Big Ten has just as much flotsam as the ACC does. I mean, you start looking at those teams, you look at the Indianas and the Northwesterns and the Purdues and teams like that. There's a bunch of, garbage football teams that are not going to travel. They won't have anybody here. So it's really not that much different to me than the ACC in terms of, now you've got an elite, obviously got a lot more money. You've got some really elite programs at the top with the Ohio State, Michigan, let's even say Nebraska, because they're going to bring their crazy fans or a great fan base. They haven't been that good on the field. Penn State's obviously in there, but man, the bottom level is just as bad as the bottom level as the ACC in my mind.
Yeah, if you thought hotel minimums were bad before FSU's in the SEC, imagine what they would be if they're in the SEC. Florida State fans,
Woo.
Am I right? The Airbnb.
That's a plus for the Big Ten, right?
That's correct.
Also, the trailer parks would be packed. I mean,
oh my gosh, have to double the size of the.
Boy, it feels like there's a joke there.
That shot.
I don't know, but maybe not. For folks who are interested in the full roundtable, it is linked underneath this video on Warchant TV. You can go to the site warchant.com. That is your home for all the best coverage when it comes to everything Florida State, but specifically as these big conversations are being had over the next couple of years. This is where you want to be at warchant.com. So make sure to subscribe to the proper website, and you can subscribe here to Warchant TV for absolutely free. We're going to leave on this note, guys. It's opening kickoff of the 2026 football season, and Florida State is a member of what jersey patch do they have on the front there? Does it say ACC or something else? Go ahead, Gene.
Oh, man, throwing to me first. 2026. Man, that's just 2 seasons. Oh. I'll say SEC. I think the Big Ten is going to come running. The ESPN won't want to let them get away, and they'll do it. And we'll be opening with how about a little Georgia or some? Wait, Georgia's already scheduled though, so I don't know how that's going to work out. So maybe we'll have Alabama in here if that works.
All right, Ira, what do you think?
In honor of the Preakness and the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown races are going right now, I'm going to go win, place, and show. I'm going to go SEC is win, most likely. Place, I'm going to go Big Ten, and I'm going to go ACC to show. I think
Okay.
that's the most likely scenario is SEC, then the Big Ten, then least likely the ACC.
So nobody's putting in the top 3 a brand new conference. It's going to be either the status quo or one of the other Power 2, yeah?
I just think that's a tough sell. I mean, it could happen. If they don't have any other option, that's what they'll do. But I think they would, there's enough risk with just trying to challenge a grant of rights and all this. I think that's a big bite to chew.
All right. Trailer park owners in Tallahassee are on the edge of their seats to find out what their future revenue stream will look like. What will it be? We'll find out, and we'll document it for you on warchant.com and Warchant TV. For Ira, for Gene, I'm Tom. We'll talk to you next time on Warchant TV.